All right, welcome back to another installment of Cocktails and Criticism. I don't have a cocktail tonight, but I was going to just briefly give a little, some background on the page, on the channel, and what I collect, what I do, and what I'm into. So, I call the channel the Bargain Basement Baudelaire. Meaning that I know a little bit about a lot of stuff. I think I've said it before. I came up with the name from an episode of The Simpsons from I think the first or second season, where Montgomery Burns is writing his autobiography and he has a ghostwriter. And he gets mad at the ghostwriter. He calls him a bargain basement Baudelaire. I happen to be very fond of Charles Baudelaire. His poetry was some of my favorite poetry when I was an adolescent. So let me give you a little bit of a background rundown of the kind of stuff that I'm into, the kind of stuff that you'll be seeing me talk about on the channel. Primarily, growing up, I read mostly nothing but comic books, choose your own adventure books, science fiction, fantasy. I'm talking elementary school through junior high school. The author I read most prolifically in junior high was Stephen King. I am a late Gen Xer. I was born in 1976, so my years of junior high were at the very end of the 1980s. So the kind of comic books that I read were the ones that were really popular and readily available at the corner store, at the drugstore, and at the grocery store. The kind of things that you could run in and they were right there on the rack, kind of. I did go to a couple of comic book stores in my early teenage and my teenage years, but I lived in the suburbs. I grew up in a suburb of Houston. And the suburbs that I grew up in did not have comic book store, so I had to make do with what I had. So that basically means I read a lot of X-Men, Spider-Man, Hulk, Avengers, Batman, Superman. The things that you could buy that were regular good sellers. And I was, just coming out of being a kid. I grew up in a time where you had the Spider-Man and Amazing Friends Saturday morning cartoons. Grew up with that, so all of those characters that you would have seen on that cartoon, I was into. It wasn't until I really got into looking at more diverse writing that I got into more independent books, and I started to branch out into other things. So I'll talk a lot about different writers and storylines from those eras of comic books. I started really kind of veering off in my early teenage years when I was first introduced to Moon Knight. I was probably around 12 or 13 when I was introduced to Moon Knight, maybe a little younger. It may have been 11. A friend of mine had some Moon Knight comic books that he gave me. That was something that was really different. Rom was another, but I would see every so often, especially in the middle part of the 80s, getting 86, 84, 85, 86. The Marvel magazines, I did pick up a few of those. And those would be the things that I would kind of be feeding into as I was going to comic book stores. You see a bunch of my comic book stuff, behind me. That's going to be stuff that's behind me primarily. Yeah, I'll talk about all of these things, like this one, this one. This is a Neil Adams print. These are all. Yeah, I like. There'll be things that I get into about those things later on down the line. So that's my comic book thing. I still I don't read comic books anymore, like ones that are being published currently. Um, for two reasons. And I'm not one of those like old get off my lawn type. Oh, these are all woke and that kind of stuff. That stuff. I don't talk about politics. I don't talk about my politics on this, and I think it's kind of irrelevant. There's so much of that going on social media anyway. I think this is a place where we can have a good break from that. I don't read new comics because I feel like there's been a diminishing scope of actual reading in the books. The word count's gone down. I don't feel like, and I also feel like the page count has kind of gone down. I don't feel like there's a lot of reading going on. So that's one reason why I don't read comic books anymore. The other is the cost. I mean, not that I couldn't afford to buy a couple of books a month and have a pull box at my local comic book store. I mean, it very easily could do that. And I mean, you know, I'm got a job and I'm able to do that. But it's just not financial. Can't justify spending the cover price on a product that I don't feel like is giving me the same entertainment value that it had given me in the past. But I don't knock the stories. I don't knock what's going on. I don't even know what's going on now. But I kind of feel like it's time. I'm looking down the barrel at 50 years old. It's time to sort of let these characters represent the younger generation, whatever generation that is. I'm perfectly content with going back to the back issues that I've had and that I never had before that I can buy, and revisiting the nostalgia of those characters. So that's what I do. That's my but I will talk about some of the relevance of these characters and these stories as I go on. The other thing that I'll talk about a lot on this channel is literature. The Cocktails and Criticism is basically about me talking about an author. I will make a cocktail that either represents something that an author has written. It might be one of the author's favorite drinks, or it might be a drink that I think reminds me of something I've read from the author. I'm not a mixologist. I'm just a guy who enjoys drinking alcohol. Sometimes I have to push the brakes. I've taken this summer to kind of slow down. I was drinking a little bit too much in the fall and the spring. So I kind of pumped the brakes a little bit. And you can tell I put on a lot of weight. And that's primarily because when you drink a little bit too much, your eating habits become poor. Not that I'm eating the wrong things, I'm just overindulging. It's a circle. But I started to get really interested in literature. I have a master's degree in literature. I wrote my master's thesis on James Joyce's Ulysses. So I went full throttle with literature. I got interested in literature because at around the age 14, my father passed away, and I started to look to various other forms of way to release some of the, I guess, angst. And so I went and started to read more. And one of and I started listening to a more broad range of music at that time. One of the things that I started to do was listen to more like uh, classic rock. But at that time, I was listening to things from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, but not so much the 70s. 14, it was the 50s and the 60s. That was what was on the oldies station at the time. 70s rock was still like kind of hard rock, where you could turn it on the hard rock station and they would play like Led Zeppelin, and Rush and like Van Halen, but Metallica would be on there too. So like some of that 70s rock hadn't really like swung to the classic rock genre. It was there in some bits and pieces, like some of the Fleetwood Mac and some of the Zeppelin. But I mean, it wasn't, like the way it is today. The Doors was a band that I really kind of caught my attention. And so I read Jim Morrison's biography, and he was a very interesting singer to me because he wasn't like the hippies. He wasn't like the Grateful Dead or Jefferson Airplane singers. He was a little bit darker. I liked that. I felt like, Paul McCartney was a little bit like a goody two-shoes. And Jim Morrison wasn't quite like that, so I liked him more. And all the stuff that the biography said that he read in high school, I started to read. One of one of those writers happened to be Charles Baudelaire. So I got into Charles Baudelaire and Arthur Rimbaud and all the French symbolist poets, and so I just became really immersed in literature of all types, and it not just like, I don't know, maybe subversive might be the word. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't just reading Nietzsche or Sartre, or those French symbolists or Joyce. I was also reading sort of mildly contemporary stuff too. So and I read Dickens, and I read Dumas and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and whatever. And got in high school, Kerouac became a big point, and then Salinger and those guys. So yeah, I will talk about those writers from time to time, and I have some definite opinions that I have about their work and about their influence and stuff like that. I know a lot of people, can look at somebody with a master's degree in literature and probably think that I, appreciate all writers, and I don't. I have some opinions. Some of my opinions are not popular amongst people who have the same degree or higher than me. I definitely have a lot of I've had a lot of debates in graduate school about some of the things that I see and I believe as far as like literature goes, but that's a big deal to me. Movies and popular culture has always been an important part of my youth. I watched a lot of television. I enjoy all of the, pop culture stuff from the 80s and the 90s and even the 70s, the stuff that I can remember from the 70s. So I will mention that kind of stuff from time to time. Music, it's another big one. I went from listening to a lot of just top 40 in the early to mid 80s. To junior high, I kind of went all over the place. For a little while, I was into metal. I mean, I loved Bon Jovi. I loved Motley Crue and Van Halen and like Dokken and you know, like more along the lines of what was MTV metal. I think that would be the best word for it today. MTV metal. It was not as dangerous as, say, like Saxon and Exodus and Slayer and Metallica. You know, Iron Maiden. That stuff was a little bit more intense and that. But I started to get into that. But then also in the 80s, this really big influx of hip hop started. That was interesting. But what really caught my attention was what a lot of people nowadays, or back then, I guess, called it alternative music. Or indie music. I don't know what it's only independent music to me if it is distributed by a label that is not in any way, shape, or form associated with a major record label. And that started to happen in the 1980s. Unfortunately, all of these really independent record companies started to become subsidiaries of big conglomerated record companies and entertainment companies. And then alternative would have meant an alternative to like what people were listening to. But you can't be called like The Cure was called an alternative band. But I mean, they're selling millions of records. So what are they an alternative to? You know, like if people know who you are, you're really not an alternative to anything popular. You are popular. But that was the kind of music that I got interested in. So by about the 8th grade was when I got my first Joy Division album. That was kind of like the tipping point, I guess you could say. Like I was playing around with a lot of different kind of things, you know, so like I would go to the record store. I used to have these cassette singles. I'm going to have a whole thing about my cassette singles here sooner or later. But they were like about $1.99 each. It was the song. It was, you know, it was like the 7-inch single that when you bought the 45, right? But I no longer had a record player by the time I got to the 7th grade. The 6th and 7th grade, we no longer had record players, so we had to use cassettes. If I really, really liked a song, I wouldn't just record it off of the radio, making like a mixtape. I wanted to get the single. I wanted to be able to have like the official release. It was like a thing for me. It was like important. So I would have, like, you could look at my singles and it would be like Depeche Mode, Tone Loc, and Motley Crue. It was like all over the place. Even my cassettes, like Huey Lewis and the News, Def Leppard, Belinda Carlisle, you know, and then it'd be like Erasure. It was all over the place. But then Joy Division happened, and that was like in the 8th grade. And then I put away all those other cassettes. I put them in a shoebox and hid them. You never see the light of day. Belinda Carlisle never. I would sneak into my sister's room and listen to her Tiffany and Debbie Gibson cassettes, and then I wouldn't do that anymore. So music is big. I'll talk a lot about music on the channel. So anyway, if you've made it this far, so hope you subscribe. That's what I talk about on the channel. I just kind of give my 2 cents. Not an expert in any of this stuff. This is just my opinions about it. It's not meant to be like scathing criticisms or like mean-spirited. It's just what I think. Like I said, I'm not trying to espouse any kind of like negativity. I want to talk more about what I like rather than what I don't like. So hopefully you're on board, and I'll see you in the next one.